Hi everyone, welcome back to Blender. If you haven't already, I recommend that you go back and watch at least the first few minutes of the previous Blender tutorial, just because in that tutorial I explained some of the basic controls that you'll need to operate Blender. So let's get started with today's. Here we are in our startup Blender screen. So it gives us this default cube. We don't want the cube. We're just going to click on it and then hit delete to get rid of it, because we're going to load in some meshes of a bird wing. So I'm going to go File, Import, and then OBJ, because they're OBJs. Then I'm going to navigate to the meshes that I want. So here I've got a folder with different meshes that all belong to the same model. Next to each mesh, you'll see how big it is, and this will give you an indication of how long Blender will take to read them in. So this one's almost 50, and that should take a bit less than 30 seconds to load in, and the others will take a little bit less than that. One really annoying thing about Blender is that you can only load in one OBJ or any type of surface mesh at a time. It is annoying, but it is just one of the quirks of Blender, and it's something that you kind of just have to deal with. So I'm going to click Import OBJ, and it's importing those carpals. Now we can't see them yet, and that is because they are very big mesh files. So what I'm going to do is just use my scrolly wheel and keep zooming out until I see them. There they are up here. So those are my carpals, and you'll see they're not quite in the middle because we are using multiple meshes, and the origin or the center of orientation is here. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute, but I'm just going to import the next mesh. So if these meshes all have the same origin, they should open up nicely articulated and in the right positions. So there we go. Yep, that looks great. I'm going to keep opening meshes until I have them all done, and I'm just going to pause the recording while I do that. Okay, so I have loaded all of my meshes in, and you can see them there. You can also see them up here in the scene collection panel. These are all the meshes that I just loaded in, and I can select them here, or I can flick the visibility on and off. There's also a couple of objects here, camera and light, which you won't need to use, but that's what these things are. They look really small because this mesh is really big, but this is a light and this is the camera. Okay. So the first thing I want to do to this mesh, or this set of meshes, is to change the origin. So the origin is that little orange point in the middle of the 3D cursor there. And you'll see that all of these meshes have the same origin. And this is because whoever made these meshes made them using the same 3D volume. So the origin point here is probably the middle, the center point of the original CT reconstruction. And basically, Blender thinks that this is the middle of your scene. Sketchfab will also think this if you were to load these meshes in. And that's not really optimal for manipulation, so I'm going to change the origin. So to change the origin, I'm going to use the 3D cursor, which is that little red and white circle in the middle there. And to move that, I'm just going to select this tool here. And then I can either click where I want it to go, or I can click and drag it around. And I'm just going to try and sit it in the middle of my little scene there somewhere, in a place that I think would be a good center of rotation. Then I'm going to go back to my selection tool, and I'm going to select all of my meshes. Now it looks like there's 3 origins here, but one of these things is your light and one of them is your camera. So now I'm going to right click, set origin, and then set origin to 3D cursor. Okay, so now it's set the origin to where my 3D cursor is, and we can check just by selecting individual meshes that they all have the same origin. Basically, we've just defined only this as being the scene, since the rest of the body of this animal is not there. So now I want to do some actual editing on the meshes. If I hit Alt-Z, that's going to put me into X-ray view. And I just wanted to show you that inside of this mesh, there are a lot of internal structures that we don't necessarily need. So what this is doing is just adding a lot of memory to this data set that I don't need and making it slower to work with. So I'm going to show you how to get rid of those, or most of those, using some of the selection tools in Blender. So right now we're in object mode, and that lets us edit objects as a whole. We can move them around or rotate them, but we want to edit the mesh itself. So we're going to move into edit mode. You can also enter edit mode by hitting the tab key. There we go. Okay, so now we can see, well, I'm going to go Alt-Z and put this out of X-ray mode now, just so you can see the polygons and the vertices, which are the points. So I usually find it easier to switch up here to just viewing polygons as opposed to the vertices as well. It just makes it easier on my eyes, but everyone has their own preferences. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is use my selection tool here, and I'm just going to select a little piece of this external part of the mesh. And then I'm going to go up here to select linked, and then linked, or Control L, and I'm going to click that. And it's just selected all of the polygons that are connected to that original selection. You can see that's pretty much the whole thing. If I hit Alt-Z again and go back into X-ray mode, you can see those black points in there. Those are polygons that have not been selected. And those are just sort of floating internal structures, so some of the things that we don't need. One thing that you'll want to look at here is how much of this mesh that you're actually going to remove if you delete parts of it. So down here you can see the number of faces and the number of vertices. You can see that there's about 1.27 million faces in the original mesh, and right now I have about 1.9 million of them selected. I've selected the outside, but that's not the part that I want to delete, so I'm just going to go up to select and then invert, and that's just going to invert my selection, obviously. So now I've got some of those internal parts that I don't want. I'm going to hit delete, and I'm going to delete. You can either delete faces or vertices, it doesn't really matter for this part. Just thinking about it. Okay, so I've deleted those internal parts. There are still a lot of internal structures there that I don't need, so I'm going to take a bit of a different approach now. So I'm going to switch back into opaque mode, and I'm just going to turn off the visibility for the other meshes here. And because it's opaque, it's only going to select the polygons that I can see from my point of view using the select tool. And I'm just going to go around and select all of those outside polygons. Just rotate all the way around. Make sure you hold down Shift while you're doing this, otherwise it won't add to your selection, it will just create a new selection. And keep doing that, and then we'll have a few holes here, but there's a way that we can fix that, fix most of that, and that is to go up here to select more or less, and you want to select more. So basically that's just going to expand your original selection, and you'll see some of these holes start to fill. So it's also Control and the addition sign, the shortcut for that, and you can keep hitting that until you've got all of the outside or everything you need selected. You might like to keep adding to the selection using this tool, especially for some big chunks like that one up there. You can see that Blender's thinking a lot about this mesh because it is quite a large mesh compared to the others. So then do the same thing. And just keep expanding. I might just pause this while I finish this off. So now I've selected all of the outside polygons that I can get to. I'm going to go to Select and then Invert. So that's just going to select all of the polygons except the ones that I already had selected. If I hit Alt-Z and go into X-ray view, you can see everything that has been selected is inside of this humerus. So now I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to hit delete. This time I'm just going to delete faces. If I hit vertices, that's going to delete more than what I want because it's going to delete the faces that I have selected plus the connected ones. So I'm just going to hit faces. And that's going to delete all of those internal structures. And you'll see that down here I've gone from 1.2 million faces to 200,000 odd. And that is a pretty big reduction just from deleting those internal structures. If I go back into object mode, we can see a bit more clearly what's happened. So this is still transparent, so there's still a few there, but they're mostly gone, and these ones are mostly connected to those outside holes, so you sort of need those ones there anyway. But that looks pretty good. So if you want to reduce the size of your meshes, you could do that with all of them, but I'm just going to continue on working on the next thing. So the next thing I want to do is spread this wing out. You can see it's all folded up, and I'm going to rotate the bones around to put the wing in a bit more of a easier to interpret position. And so I'm going to start with the humerus, which I've got selected here. I want to rotate it. I'm going to use this tool. But first, I need to change the pivot point. So if I hit rotate now, the trackball for rotating, which is here, comes up at the middle of the origin there. If I was to try and rotate this object now, it's just going to go up all over the place, and I don't want that. I'm just going to hit Control Z here, that's undo. So what I'm going to do is select my 3D cursor tool, and I'm going to move the cursor to somewhere that I want to rotate from. So I want the humerus to rotate from this end. So I'm just going to try and stick it on the very end of this humerus. And that looks pretty good. So now when I go to my rotate tool, here's my trackball, but I'm going to hit the period key and it's going to bring up this little pie menu. So it's asking me, where do you want to rotate from? I want the 3D cursor. So now my trackball's changed position. So now when I use this trackball, it's going to rotate from that position. So you can have a bit more control over this than just grabbing the ball and moving it. You can rotate along any particular axis using the colored wheels here, or you can sort of visually line up your axis that you want to rotate along, and then use this white wheel, and that will rotate along the plane of view there. So you can sort of play around with it a bit. I find that using the white wheel gives me a lot of control over it, and I prefer doing that. And then just try and rotate it till it's in the right position. So I don't think that's right, but anyone can correct me. And this is just for demonstration purposes, so I'm just going to rotate it into about what looks like the right position. That looks okay. So now you'll see the problem that's happened is that the origin of this object has stayed the same while I've rotated it, it's moved with it. So now these objects will have different origins. So what we'll do is at the end, we will do the same thing, select all of the objects and then reset the origin. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to do this for this one as well. So now, because we're using a different object, we'll want a different center of rotation. So I'm just going to do the same thing. Move the 3D cursor to where I want to rotate from. Hit rotate. You can, if you would prefer, rotate from your active element. That will just use the origin, the center of your element. The median point, that will select the sort of average point between all of the meshes. Individual origins, bounding box center, you can select any of those options, but for something like this, you'll need your 3D cursor. And just keep going along and rotating things where they need to go. Oh, look at that. So for this part, I need to rotate all of these objects at once. I'm just going to hit Control Z and undo that mistake. So now I want all of these objects to rotate together. So all I'm going to do is hold down Shift, select the other objects that I want, and then I'm just going to keep rotating. So now it's just going to rotate them all at once from that same center pivot point. Now this is sort of at an okay angle, I think, but it needs to be in a different position. So it needs to move a little bit further that way. So I'm just going to select the move tool here, and you can either use these little squares to rotate along, to move along any two axes, or you can move along any single axis by using the arrows. I like using the squares personally. And just move that into the right place. And you can keep moving and rotating until you feel like you're happy with the position. So I'm just going to pause the recording while I do a bit of rotating. So I've just been rotating these bones around. They look like they're sort of overall in an okay position. It's not super correct, but just for demonstration purposes, it's okay. I want to show you how to move parts of a mesh individually. So basically, all I'm going to do is separate these two parts of the mesh by going into edit mode. Okay, and then I'm going to go Alt-Z into X-ray mode, and then I'm going to select one part. Oops. Make sure you hold down Shift to add to your selection. So I've got this bottom carpal selected now. I'm just going to right click, separate, selection. You'll see it's just created a new mesh up in your mesh panel here. It's created a new mesh. So now there's two carpal meshes. If I go back into object mode, they're two different objects. So now I can move these independently of one another. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because in birds, it's my understanding that this carpal rotates around while this one slides forward in a different direction. So there will be many cases where you will have meshes that are made up of multiple elements and you'll want to move those elements independently of each other. Sometimes they're very hard to separate, so in a lot of meshes all the phalanges will be together. If you want to move them independently of each other, you need to separate them, which can be hard if the bones are very close together. But this part was really easy. So I'm just going to rotate these into the right position. Okay, so I've finished doing all of the rotating and things that I want to do. Now you'll notice that they all have different origins. So I'm just going to use my select box. I'm going to select all of the meshes. I'll need to move this 3D cursor first. Where should I want to rotate from? Probably somewhere about there, I think. It's about the middle. That will do. So then right click, set origin, 3D cursor. Okay, so then the origins of these objects, select tool, the origins of these objects are all the same again. So now what I would want to do would be to export these meshes. So select the one that I want. Let's say I want to export the humerus first. I would go File, Export, OBJ. Let's go back into the working folder, and I always find it most useful to just create a new folder and call it the same thing as the old one, except we will add what we did to it. So we simplified and repositioned these meshes. So now I'm going to save all of my new meshes in here. Make sure you rename them. And when you're saving individual meshes from a scene that contains multiple meshes like this, make sure you click selection only. Otherwise, that's going to write one OBJ and it's going to contain all of the meshes. And then you're going to have trouble allocating colors and things in other programs like Sketchfab or whatever you use. So then we will click Export OBJ, and that will just take a little while to write the new file. So once it's done that, you can do the same thing. Select the next mesh that you want to save, File, Export, make sure selection only. Once you tick the box once, the selection only box should stay ticked. And so then you can export all of those meshes, and your new set of meshes will be repositioned and, if you so choose, simplified to make them take up less memory. So that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed, and as always, feedback or suggestions are appreciated.